5 years. She has been on CNN, the PBS NewsHour, Democracy Now!, NPR, the BBC, and more. Phyllis is now the International Advisor for Jewish Voice for Peace. A recent article that she published was entitled, Killing Palestine by Blocking Aid, Killing Palestine by Airdropping Aid. The airdrops are not designed to save lives, but to salvage the consciences of those who could and should be doing so much more. So tonight, she's going to talk about what's happening and what more we can do. We are proud to present the always relevant and insightful expert, Phyllis Bennis. Welcome, Phyllis.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate that. Thanks to the Huntington Woods Peace Center, to the Education and Huntington Woods Peace Education and Citizens Project, because that's a whole long name, and Peace Action of Michigan, and the Michigan Peace Alliance. And I will add to that, thank you very much, Michigan, for the uncommitted votes in the recent election that presented a kind of example for much of the rest of the country and is already part of a movement that is bringing crucial pressure to bear on this administration to stop enabling genocide, which is what is going on right now in Gaza. The demand for a ceasefire has been the demand we've raised from day one of the Israeli assault on Gaza that began immediately following the attack of October 7th. And that remains our main demand. We don't have it yet. So, I hear sometimes from activists saying, enough with this, the ceasefire thing. We want more than a ceasefire. We want freedom. We want national rights. We want all human rights. And I'll say, yeah, but to do that, people have to live. So we still need a ceasefire first. We're still in that emergency mode, if you will. But even with that emergency mode, I think it is important that we know some history, that we share our understanding of what that history is. And I think what's always true is that our understanding of history, of any history, is always affected and sometimes really directly shaped by when we start the clock. So what we hear a lot is October 7th, what happened on October 7th, what happened in response to October 7th, the horrors of October 7th, which clearly were very real. But what's not true is that history started on October 7th. It didn't. It didn't. It wasn't even close. History of Palestinian oppression is rooted in 75 years of apartheid, way before it was called that, of course. 55 years of military occupation of what is now known as the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. 17 years of a siege of Gaza. The siege that was imposed on October 7th with such crippling, horrific results was really not a new siege at all. It was an escalation of a siege that had been underway for 17 years. And I'll tell you something, I've been working on this issue for a long time. And I thought I knew, not everything, obviously, but kind of a lot about what the siege of Gaza looked like. Partly because I had done a lot of research about the siege and the imposition of sanctions on Iraq, in particularly the 10 years between the 1991 Gulf War and the war that began in 2003. But I learned something recently in looking at the current situation in Gaza that was stunned me, which was that the siege of Gaza over those 17 years, what began in 2006, was severe enough that 20% of Gaza children were stunted by the age of 2. That was a new study. And I was stunned by that. I had no idea that the deprivation of decent food was bad enough to create stunting in 20% of babies. But that was the reality. The Israeli response to the horrific crimes that were committed on October 7th, and October 7th was a complicated thing that was partly horrific crimes against civilians, partly not crime, partly attacks on on military targets, which is under international law legitimate for a people suffering under military occupation. But 2/3 or more of the people who were killed on that day were civilians. Clear violation of international law, a horrific crime. And very much like the crime of 9/11, and we heard a lot of analogies to what happened on 9/11. There was this choice. How do you respond? Do you treat it for what I believe it was, a huge crime, and do your best to go after the people who had committed that crime and bring them to justice? Or do you treat it as something that deserves a war against an entire population, the overwhelming majority of whom had nothing to do with it? Whether it was the people of Afghanistan, who had nothing to do with the attacks on the Trade Center, or whether it was Gaza, where 2.3 million people, of whom somewhere around 15 to 20,000 were armed militants, had to live, and going to war against all of them. And what we saw was that the Israelis made the same choice that the US government made. And unfortunately, with massive levels of popular support, as was true in the United States. Most of you will remember what happened after 9/11 when George Bush announced that the response was going to be to take the world to war. 88% of the people in the United States agreed with that and said war was the appropriate response. And in some ways, it's not surprising because the choice we were given was we either go to war or we let him get away with it. And since nobody wanted to let him get away with it, war was the only option. The notion that there could be a different response, a response based on international justice, collaboration with other countries, police actions, all the various things that would be possible, was never even on offer, was never even considered, nor was it in Israel. So when President Biden warned the Israelis, as he put it, that they shouldn't go crazy like we did after 9/11, was the way he put it, he then began the process that had been underway for decades, for generations, of enabling the Israeli response of going crazy like we did on 9/11, doing exactly the same thing, violating the same international laws. But it was something that did not have to be this way. It was a choice. And it was a choice that was rooted in Israeli history. There's always been an effort by many, obviously not all Israelis, but a key component from the formation of the Israeli state was designed to get rid of the Palestinians from the land, to take the land without the people, to make real what Golda Meir had claimed it already was, and certainly was not when she said it in the late 50s, a land without a people for a people without a land. Certainly the Jewish refugees and survivors of the Holocaust were by then a people without a land. But Palestine was very far from a land without people. So the early Zionist militias, their job was to make it so, to get rid of the people off the land. And that's what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1947-48, what Israelis call the War of Independence, which led to the creation of an independent state of Israel and led to the expulsion, the dispossession of 750,000 Palestinians from their land. 70% of the population of Gaza before October 7th were refugees from that catastrophe. The number of people in Gaza now who have been displaced from their homes is more than twice that. More than 1.5 million have been displaced. And so when we hear about the crime of genocide, it isn't just designed to shock people. It's not just there to make people sort of cringe and say, that can't be true. Israel can't be committing genocide. Israel was created in response to a genocide, which is partly true, partly not true, but that's irrelevant. What's relevant is that genocide is a very specific international crime. And it's different from other international crimes in a couple of different ways. One is that the law of genocide, it's called the Convention Against the Crime, it's actually called the Convention Against, the Convention for the Prevention and Ending of the Crime of Genocide. So it speaks both to preventing and stopping the crime. unlike a lot of international law, is actually pretty easy to understand. A lot of international law is really opaque. You know, you read it 5 times and say, what the hell were they talking about? You know, it's not even like lawyer talk, which is bad enough, but it's a very particular kind of law that is, you know, very, very difficult to wade through. The Genocide Convention is relatively short, it's relatively specific, and it's actually quite easy to understand. For some acts of violence to be considered genocide, 2 things have to exist. One is what's known as a specific intent crime, which any of you who are criminal lawyers know that term. It's, you know, it's like if you do something, it might be illegal across the board, but a particular crime won't be there unless you intended it for a certain reason. Like if you break into a house and you just were doing it to, you know, have a good time, that might get you arrested for something like, you know, destruction of property. Unless you intended to steal stuff, in which case, then it becomes burglary. You broke down the door or broke a window in order to do something else. You had a specific intent to do something. So one of the parts of genocide is there has to be a specific intent, in this case, to destroy all or part of a group. And the group can be ethnic or religious or racial or language. It can be a lot of different things, but it has to be a specific identifiable group. You don't have to intend to kill them. You just have to intend to destroy all or part of it as a group, which could mean a variety of things, not necessarily killing anybody, although that's one possibility. The other thing you have to do, besides have the intent to destroy all or part of the group, is to commit at least one of 5 named acts of violence to make that happen, to make that real. And the 5 acts are named in the convention. They're pretty straightforward. 1 is killing members of the group. 2 is injuring members of the group. 3 is creating conditions that make it impossible for all or part of the group to survive as a group. 4 is preventing births within the group. And 5 is transferring children out of the group to the custody of some other group, bringing them somewhere else. Israel has been, from the beginning, committing at least 4 of those 5 acts. And on the question of the specific intent, unlike every other genocide that has taken place in history, from the Holocaust on, when it was first named, there's always been an effort by those committing the genocide to kind of deny what they're about, to say, you know, this just happened. You know, this is what happens in war or something like that. In this case of Israel, in Gaza, in 2023 and into 2024, Israeli officials, from the president to the prime minister, to the defense minister, the defense secretary, to other cabinet members, to military leaders, to a bunch of different random members of the Knesset, all kinds of influential political and military leaders across the board, from many different parties, not only from Netanyahu, have made explicit statements about their intention. Statements saying there are no civilians in Gaza, everybody is guilty, calling to kill them all, calling for Gaza to be erased, saying that the people of Gaza are human animals and we will treat them as such. Famously, Bibi Netanyahu talking about the Amalek story from the Bible that called for the complete destruction of everyone among the defeated people. And it explicitly said, kill them all, men and women, children and suckling babies, and even the animals that they depend on for food. And they mentioned specifically goats and camels. And I must say, when I read that, it wasn't something I was familiar with from Sunday school when I was growing up. What I was struck by was how familiar it was to the history of this country. We heard the acknowledgement earlier about the expropriation of native land in this country. And the Indian Wars, as they were known, from around mostly the period of the late 1800s, we heard that kind of language when we saw the same kind of genocidal attacks. One of the most famous was the Sand Creek Massacre, when Colonel John Chivington, who happened to be a Methodist minister at the time, was commanding his troops, and he ordered them to attack a native village on the shores of Sand Creek. And some of the soldiers came to him and said, we can't do that. It's a sleeping village. It's the middle of the night. They're all asleep. It's women and kids. What are you telling us to go kill them? We promised to protect these people. And his answer was, nits make lice, kill them all. They will grow up to be people we hate, so kill them while they are babies. This is the same language we heard from Israeli officials talking about Gaza. We heard this described as how we need a second Nakba, that this is Gaza Nakba, this is Nakba 2.0. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it for a reason. That's the specific intent that makes it genocide. And the other thing that's interesting about the Genocide Convention, and this is something that made the South African initiative, which I'll get to in a second, so important, was that unlike maybe all of other international laws, there may be some exceptions, I'm not sure, but I don't know of them if there are. The Genocide Convention doesn't just say that it's prohibited to commit genocide or to support genocide. It includes the obligations of every country that signs the Genocide Convention, which, not surprisingly, is a whole lot of countries. 153 countries are signatories, parties to the Genocide Convention. And the convention imposes obligations on those signatories to either prevent a coming genocide or to do everything in its power to end an existing genocide if it should occur. The US, of course, is a signatory, is a party to the Genocide Convention. And yet its response to the genocide has been exactly the opposite of that obligation. Instead of calling for, an end to the genocide, saying that what Israel was doing is genocide, saying we're not going to provide any more arms, they doubled down on sending money, sending arms, all of those things. And in that context, the $3.8 billion a year in direct military aid to the IDF that the US has been giving for years and years is part of enabling it. That, when you compare it like to the US military budget, it's chump change. It's a rounding error. 3.8 billion, that's nothing. But in the Israeli context, that's 20% of its entire military budget that we have been subsidizing for years. We don't subsidize the military budget of any other country. And it's not like Israel is some impoverished country that has no money to buy its own guns. It's depending on whether you believe the CIA or the World Bank figures, it's either I think it's either the 23rd or the 27th wealthiest country in the world. So what are we doing? We're enabling genocide. That's what we're doing. Now they're debating still in Congress, sending an additional $14 billion directly to the Israeli military under Netanyahu to make it possible for them to escalate this genocide, which President Biden keeps telling us he thinks needs to be kind of toned down. Not ended because, the war is legitimate, but don't kill quite so many. Don't kill quite so many civilians. Don't kill quite so many children. So that's what we're looking at here. In the last several months, what we just found out there was a big expose in anywhere. It was in Politico, I think, in maybe the Washington Post, somewhere else. It turns out that there have been over 100 arms shipments sent directly to the Israeli military in the last several months without any of them going for congressional approval, because what they did was to take a giant military grant that they wanted to give to Israel, knew it wouldn't be approved, so they broke it down into more than 100 little grants so that each one was just under the minimum required that makes it necessary for them to go to Congress. It was so underhanded. Technically, each one was legal because, the idea is that the White House can agree to send, a few boxes of rifles or something to somebody. That's kind of the idea of it. But what they did was to send over 100 small boxes of many different things that included tank ammunition that is being used, anti-tank weapons are being used against buildings across Gaza, including hospitals. And they're sending bomb parts, including the parts that make gravity bombs, smart bombs. And they're continuing to send the 1,000 and 2,000 pound bombs, the biggest ones in both the Israeli and the US arsenals. The only thing bigger and more powerful are nuclear weapons, which of course both the US and Israel have. But 2,000 pound bunker buster bombs that are a big part of the reason that Gaza, when you see those videos taken from helicopters or from drones, you see the absolute devastation, the absolute destruction of the entire infrastructure of cities, towns, camps, olive tree groves, everything. 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs will do that. So that's the context. That's what it looks like when you have 75 years of trying to expel Palestinians from their land. So now we have a situation where South Africa, after generations of dealing with its own legacy of apartheid, and now dealing with the legacy of its own, was the first government prepared to recognize apartheid when they saw it. This began the relationship of South Africa to the international law violations in Gaza and in Palestine in general. Didn't start on October 7th either. It goes way back. And in this case, they recognized apartheid. They'd been working for over a year with other countries, a few other countries at the UN, to bring about the resumption of the old Special Committee Against Apartheid, which helped build the global anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s and into the 90s against South African apartheid. Many of you will remember that movement, one of the most powerful global progressive movements that ever happened in the world. And then when October 7th and its aftermath happened, they took one look and said, we need to respond to this. And they realized that this was not something about the International Criminal Court, which in theory already has an open docket on Israeli violations going back to 2014 and the attack on Gaza of 2014, which left 2,200 Palestinians killed by Israeli bombs. It was at that time the most lethal of these many attacks on Gaza that have gone on for the last 10 or 12 years. But instead to go to the International Court of Justice, which is the UN's official court. The International Criminal Court, as some of you know, is an independent institution. It was created with the help of the UN, but it's not a UN agency, it's independent. But the International Court of Justice is part of the UN. It's the UN's judicial arm, if you will. So they decided that was the most appropriate place to go on a charge against Israel. So the charge is basically South Africa bringing charges against Israel. And they took that initiative in order to force a reckoning, to force some kind of accountability. And they filed this extraordinary 87-page brief. I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to read it, but it's an extraordinary telling of the story of what took place in Gaza and what was still taking place at the time they filed it at the very end of 2023. It was in the end of December. Oops. Sorry about this. Coming up, blowing the doors open. The brief documents in painful detail what the Israeli assault looked like on the ground. And that it was very carefully drafted. It was based on facts. There was no emotional appeal. And they showed very clearly both the specific intent that Israel had put forward in very public arenas. Everything that they cited in the brief came from open source venues, from newspapers, from stuff that was said on television. None of this was hidden. None of this came out of, South Africa having been spying on Israel or something. They didn't need to do that. All of this was very, very, very public. And all of the examples of what it meant for the Palestinians on the ground, the testimony of doctors, of journalists. It's excruciating to read, but it's done very carefully to keep the focus on facts and not on emotion. And when they had their hearing on the in front of the 17 judges of the International Court, with the U.S. Judge Joan Donoghue, presiding, the president of the court, it was an extraordinary moment. They had 3 hours to present their case. And this was just a presentation of the allegations. There was no cross-examination, no witnesses. It was just the dream team of South African lawyers, extraordinary, a rainbow of lawyers across race, across gender, across generations. It was an amazing, wonderful thing to see. And it was very calm, it was very measured, and they showed that everything that they were alleging in their charge could be proven by numerous sources. The next day, the Israeli lawyers had the same 3 hours to present their defense, again, without witnesses and without cross-examination, but to present a defense. And they had a very different view, in my view, because they didn't really have a factual basis to challenge anything the South Africans were saying. They relied to a great degree on emotions. Much of what they talked about was what happened on October 7th, which from a legal vantage point has no relevance, because not because it wasn't horrifying, not because it wasn't a crime, but because those who carried it out, led by Hamas, but both other militant organizations and a lot of unaffiliated individuals who got out of this prison of Gaza when Hamas managed to knock down part of the fence that had imprisoned people in Gaza since 2006. An awful lot of people, particularly young men, ran into Israel and committed many of those horrific crimes. But none of those forces, not Hamas, not Islamic Jihad, and certainly not any of these unknown individuals, come under the jurisdiction of the court. This court is a court that deals with countries, governments, government versus government, state versus state. So they have no jurisdiction there. The other thing that made it important to recognize why that was not part of the argument, that's not part of the ruling, is that the crime of genocide is considered, there's a Latin term for it, which of course I don't remember because I never studied that. But it basically says that this is a crime that has no justification, that there's nothing that can happen that makes it okay to commit genocide. Nothing that happens to you gives you the right to commit genocide. You have certain rights when somebody attacks you, but you don't have the right to commit genocide under any condition. So for that reason also, the vast majority of the Israeli brief that focused on October 7th was an irrelevant argument. In response, the 17 lawyers issued their ruling on January 26th, and they ruled on 6 provisional measures. They ruled that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. The plausible is important because this was only the first stage of this trial. This trial is going to go on now for years, proving all of the allegations. What they were ruling on initially was an emergency request by the South Africans, saying these actions that are taking place right now are so severe, lives are at stake on a daily basis. We need an emergency, immediate ruling on whether it's plausible that this is genocide. You don't have to find that it's definitively genocide, only that it's plausible, which is a fairly low bar. But for a low bar for genocide is still very important. So the judges found that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, and they imposed 6 provisional measures on Israel to stop any looming genocide, to prevent it if it had not started yet, or to stop it if it was going on. These actions would be necessary either way. And of the 17 judges, 4 of the measures were supported by all but 1, and the other 2 were supported by all but 2. So overwhelmingly, including the US judge, which was very important because that's pretty rare. You know, the judges on the International Court are not supposed to represent their government. They're supposed to be independent judicial officers, accountable to the world, not to their own government. But we all know in the real world, most of them are pretty accountable to the agenda of their government who nominates them, right? So that's kind of the reality you expect. In this case, it didn't work. The one judge who voted against every one of them was the judge from Uganda. And there's reasons that we figured out later that it was all it was not the Ugandan government. They went to great lengths to say, this wasn't us. We didn't tell her to do this. But it was an extraordinary thing. The 6 measures that were announced, and there were actually 5 substantive things, and then the last was they were given 1 month in which to report back to the court on what they had done. None of them have been done by the Israelis. The first was to carry out all necessary measures to prevent any of those 5 acts that I mentioned earlier that make up the actions of genocide. The second was to make sure that the Israeli military did not commit any of those actions. So even though it never used the word ceasefire, nor did the South Africans ask for a ceasefire order, they were essentially calling for a unilateral ceasefire on the part of Israel to make sure its military did not commit any of those actions without even having to negotiate. The third was to punish the incitement of genocide. The fourth was to take immediate and effective measures for all necessary humanitarian assistance. And the last was to prevent the destruction of any evidence so that there could be a thorough investigation over time that would determine ultimately the proof that it was or was not, in fact, genocide, this potential plausible genocide. The report to the court was due about 3 weeks ago. It said nothing. It provided nothing because none of these things have been done. The real question for us in this country is the question of our government, the complicity question. And in that context, I mentioned before that all parties to the Convention Against Genocide have obligations to prevent or stop a genocide anywhere it might occur, anywhere in the world. And instead, the US is enabling and encouraging genocide, despite its language of concern about the humanitarian crisis, et cetera, et cetera. They're trying to add to the almost $4 billion a year they've already given to the military. They're trying to add this $14 billion, of which $10 billion is for offensive weapons. They're ignoring existing US laws, the Leahy Law and the Arms Export Control Act, all of which prohibit explicitly giving or providing or selling any weapons to any military that has caused human rights violations. There's no question that that's going on here, and they're just ignoring those laws. So what are they doing? They're refusing to call for a ceasefire, even though the administration finally, under enormous pressure, has started using the term ceasefire. They are not calling for a ceasefire. They're calling for a temporary pause long enough to get some humanitarian aid in, which is a good thing, get the hostages released, which is a good thing, whether or not a commensurate or larger number of Palestinians who are being held in Israeli prisons illegally without any due process and in violation of international law. They don't even mention that as a consideration. But most importantly, as soon as that happens, the war could go back on. That's the US position. This is a temporary halt, just to get the hostages out, make sure Hamas has no more chips, no more cards to put on the table, then we can go back to the war. And anybody else who gets killed doesn't matter. That's essentially what it amounts to. The US has a history of turning down ceasefire offers. If you look back at 2006, when Israel was at war with Lebanon, there was a call at the United Nations for an immediate ceasefire, and Condoleezza Rice, who was then George Bush's ambassador to the UN, said, absolutely not, we don't need a ceasefire yet. Presumably not enough people had died yet. Many Israelis were being killed in that war as well. In 2008 and 9, in the attack on Gaza that became known as Operation Cast Lead, right at the end of the Bush administration. Same thing, also with Condoleezza Rice, call for a ceasefire. No, we don't need a ceasefire yet. The Gaza wars, the Gaza attacks of 2012, of 2014, of 2021, and now, each time the US says, no, we don't need a ceasefire. The ceasefire will only support one side. It will, in this case, it will only support Hamas. It will only benefit Hamas. You want to shake them and say, you don't think it's going to benefit all these Palestinian children who won't be killed by the bombs, whose buildings won't collapse on them overnight while they're sleeping? They're not going to benefit? Only Hamas gunmen are going to benefit? What kind of language is this? But this is a consistent position. The response, and this is the good news, the better news, the response to all of this has been the biggest sets of protests and mobilization and movement building on the question of protecting Palestinian rights that we have ever seen in this country. The creation of organizations like the Rabbis for Ceasefire, personal favorites. They've done some great and creative actions. The work of Jewish Voice for Peace taking over Grand Central Station and taking over the Statue of Liberty, taking over the Manhattan Bridge, all of these things across the country, creative actions, disrupting business as usual to say, we're not going to let people live normal lives while our government, with our tax money, in our name, is enabling genocide. You know, there was one protest in Congress that had 80 people who were all executive directors of a bunch of different social justice organizations, about 7 or 8 of which had anything to do with war or peace or Palestine. All the rest were immigrant rights organizations and environmental justice groups and women's organizations and LGBT groups and the labor movement, unions, all kinds of other people that got themselves arrested to protest the genocide in Gaza. This has really never happened before. It's been an extraordinary thing. Muslim-led organizations. I walked into one of them. I went down to join a demonstration. There were 3,000 Muslims at prayer. And then there were rabbis and pastors and priests who all spoke at the rally as well. Student walkouts. And one of the things, 1,000 Black clergy signed on to an ad calling for a ceasefire. It was written as a full-page ad in the New York Times, and the names were so tiny, it was like 2-point type or something. You couldn't even read them because they had so many people who wanted to sign on to this ad. And then one of the things that we really, in my experience, I've never seen anything like this before, going back to like Vietnam, where inside the administration and inside Congress, this huge level of opposition. At the State Department, the first high-level resignation, another one from the Department of Education. The White House interns, this was one of my favorites, these kids, these are the most ambitious high school kids in the country, right? They all want to be president. But they took the risk of coming out, they put masks on so they wouldn't be recognized. But they came out, they wrote a public letter saying, we are not leaders today, but we aspire to lead in the future. And we cannot do our job of learning to lead while these policies of genocide are going on carried out by our government. In Congress, 500 congressional staffers walked out to the steps of the Capitol and read a statement saying, we are the ones who answer the phone in the congressional offices, and we're the ones seeing how our bosses are not listening to the American people. 80% of the American people, American voters, want a ceasefire. 80% of Democrats want a ceasefire. 68% of all voters want a ceasefire, including Republicans and everybody else. So this kind of opposition, the most recent, it was a couple of months ago now, the staff of the Biden-Harris campaign headquarters, 17 of them came out and said, Mr. President, we can't do our job. We can't get you reelected with this policy. And then we had Michigan. You all should be very proud. Michigan set the standard for what a serious protest could look like, where it's not only a moral imperative, but it's an electoral and a political imperative. If this president wants to get reelected, you know, I work at a nonprofit. We don't get involved in political campaigns, but just looking at the analysis of the policy, this is the first time in US history that a sitting president could lose re-election because of being too supportive of Israel. It's never happened. So all these new things are forcing change. We're hearing an enormous level of change in the rhetoric, in the discourse, but we're not yet seeing enough pressure to change the policy. What the US has done has now been to cut all funding to UNRWA, the only humanitarian organization that has the capacity to actually provide the necessary food, water, medical care, education, housing, everything in Gaza depends on UNRWA. And the US, on the basis of an Israeli announcement within hours of the International Court's ruling, 4 hours later, Israel said, oh, we have something new. We just found out. It turned out they had been holding this for a month, waiting for this moment. We just found out that 12 people in Gaza who work for UNRWA were members of Hamas and might have had something to do with October 7th. They had no evidence. It turned out that 2 of the people were dead, already had been killed in Israeli air raids in Gaza. UNRWA has a staff in Gaza of 13,000 people. It's the largest, by far, humanitarian organization in the world, because it doesn't just aid governments in emergency moments. It substitutes for a government for people who have no government in the West Bank, in Gaza, and particularly in the Arab countries surrounding it, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, where it's now 5 million Palestinian refugees live, and they depend on UNRWA for everything. So this notion that it's one of these even if moments, even if there was some evidence, which still has never been presented, there has still been no evidence, except that 2 of them are dead. There's still been no evidence. Even if 12 people had been members of Hamas, out of 13,000, the appropriate position then is destroy the entire institution. If that were true, after My Lai, when there were how many US soldiers involved? 20, 30? They would have had to destroy the Pentagon because that was the institution of thousands within which these, double-digit bad guys had operated. This was a shocking thing. It's also not an accident that besides being the only humanitarian institution that's capable of the scale of what's needed in Gaza right now, it's also the only institution of international law in the international system that has a mandate that includes protection of Palestinian rights as refugees, meaning their right of return, that has been denied to them since 1947 fully. It's the only institution that has that obligation to protect that mandate and to protect that right. Without that, the Palestinian right of return, which has never been made real, simply disappears. And instead, we have this humanitarian absolute disaster. I don't know how many of you saw the news yesterday of the new report that came out from the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, one of the worst possible names of a very important organization that could possibly exist. But this is an international, global organization of several UN agencies and several of the biggest humanitarian organizations that work around the world to figure out how to identify a famine. It's one of those things you wonder, how can anybody do that? How could that be somebody's job to determine when a bunch of hungry people qualify to be a real famine? But they have, of course, reduced it to numbers. I don't know them all in my head, but it has to do with how many children out of every 1,000 have already died of starvation or dehydration from lack of food or water. How many women give birth to low birth weight or dead babies. It's those kinds of numbers. And Gaza has passed them. The number that are now facing, they have 4 levels of hunger, of food, they call it food insecurity. And there is now 55% of the population of northern Gaza is at the catastrophic level, highest level. They say that 1.1 million, about half the entire population of all of Gaza, most of whom are in the south, not in the north, will soon be at that level. And what is the US response to this? Oh, we're going to have airdrops. They look so great on TV. The heroic young airmen, or men and women, by the way, use the term airmen, at the door, the open door of the hatch of the plane, pushing out pallets of food for the starving refugees below, and these graceful parachutes that are dropping parachute loads of food. But what happens? What happens when they drop them? Well, we know last week in the first load, the first Friday, 5 people were killed when one of the parachutes didn't open, and I think they're 400, 500 pounds each pallet fell on 5 people and killed them. That happens all the time. That's a given. And when you're talking about a place that is so crowded as southern Gaza, this is not just likely, but inevitable that people will be. But there's also a much more specific history of this. Some of you will remember at the time of the Afghanistan back in 2001, when the war began 3 weeks after 9/11, began on October 7th. Interesting date. And they began by bombing the cities, bombing Kabul particularly, and Kandahar. And it happened very suddenly in the night, and people ran for their lives. They left their homes, they left everything behind, grabbed their children and ran literally on foot the lucky ones on donkeys. Few had cars. Mainly people just ran to get away from the bombs. And they were heading for the mountains where there would be safety. People had villages that they had come from to the city. They were going to go to their villages. How they would get there, who knew? But they had nothing. They had no water. They had no food. They had no medicine. There were no doctors. There was no blankets. There was nothing. And within the first couple of weeks, there was starting to be winter. Winter comes early in Afghanistan, and snow. And people immediately started getting hypothermia. A few people died. And the US said, we've got to do something about this. We can't let this happen, even though it was their bombing that was creating it. And the bombing was continuing. And they went to some of the humanitarian organizations and said, what should we do? How do we get food in? And the organizations, all of them said, the only way that can work is the old-fashioned way. You use trucks to get food to the base of the mountains and donkeys to get it up there. It's the only way you can. And the US position was, no, that's not dramatic enough. It will take too long. We don't deal with donkeys. We're the US. We don't do that. We're going to use planes. We're going to have airdrops. Great. And they all said, no, it's not going to work. It's dangerous. It's too expensive. It's a distraction. They said, we're doing it. Looks great on CNN. So they created all these pallets of food. Now, there were a number of problems. The pallets had labels written in 3 languages, right? Great. English, French, and Spanish. Very useful for people who speak Dari or Pashto, most of whom don't read at all in their own language, let alone in European language. The food were MREs with stuff like peanut butter, which people had never seen before. They thought it was animal feed because they had no idea what it was. And then they wrapped them on these pallets with bright yellow plastic to protect them when they were dropped, and so they'd be visible, right? Makes a lot of sense. At the same time, they were dropping cluster bombs. And the cluster bombs were wrapped in the same bright yellow plastic. And cluster bombs, most of you probably know, these are small bombs. They're like the size of maybe a baseball, softball. And each one has many, many little bomblets inside of it. And when the bomb opens, these little bomblets are spread on a huge area. And each of them can kill, but many of them are spread. But they also have a very bad habit of not always exploding when they hit the ground. And when they don't explode, they become a landmine. And they sit there until something hits them, like a child's foot who thinks it's a toy or food, because it's bright yellow, the same color as the food packets that had maybe saved their life the day before. And children started dying because they thought they were running after food when they were running after cluster bombs. And when this became public, there was a kind of, I want to say scandal, but unfortunately it wasn't really a scandal, but there was a little bit of a scandal. And at the press conference with Donald Rumsfeld, I wrote about this in my obituary of Rumsfeld, and General Richard Myers, who was in charge at the time of the fighting in Afghanistan, the one-way fighting. And some of the journalists started saying, so what's this about the food and the cluster bombs looking the same? You're using the same wrappings. You're killing children. You got to stop this. And they said, well, it's unfortunate. And we started issuing radio broadcasts in Dari and Pashto, telling people that they look alike and that they should be very careful before they approach anything with yellow tape. And then the journalist said, but wait, are you going to stop doing it? And General Myers' answer was, we're going to stop and make it blue instead of yellow as soon as we use up all that are in pipeline. That was their concern about children being killed by this TV-motivated fake solution to the lack of food. There is a very good chance that things like that will happen now if they continue doing this. And most of all, it's a complete distraction from what needs to happen, which is, say it with me, a ceasefire, humanitarian aid, open the gates. That's what has to happen. That's what's going to be necessary to save lives, because now there are already too many people, most of them children and babies, who are so far gone on the malnutrition cycle that they can't absorb food regularly. They need medical care to renew their body's ability to absorb actual food. And if they are not quite at the level yet where they can't even imagine eating, if they're older children who maybe grab some of the food from MREs, the MREs are designed for healthy young adult soldiers. They're not designed for babies who are about to die of malnutrition. So all of this is just mind-boggling to imagine. That's what we are looking at. The US says they want to de-escalate, but their actions speak to exactly the opposites. They're the same thing to say what they're doing at the regional level. Somebody has turned off their what do you call it? Their mute. Some voices, if people could mute it would help a little bit. I'm going to be finishing soon and we'll have time for questions. The US says on the same issue around the regional tensions, we want to de-escalate, and all of their actions speak to precisely the opposite. The escalation that we're now looking at is the possibility of an attack on Rafah. Netanyahu is asking the IDF to plan for an attack on Rafah that will destroy supposedly the last 4 battalions of Hamas. And yeah, we'll do something about the civilians. We'll let them go to the center of the country now, where there is nothing, because it has all been destroyed. There is no infrastructure. There is no anything. There's no water, there's no food, there's no medicine, certainly, but there's also no shelter. There's no buildings that are left standing. So South Africa has given us this model of what it means to hold a country accountable. They're paying a huge price for it. The US is attacking South Africa terribly right now. The Congress is voting this week on a bill that would demand what they call a reevaluation of the entire relationship between the US and South Africa, aiming at ending all trade with South Africa. That's really the punishment that is underway here. But for us, we see the beginning of this extraordinary movement that has been created, that we now are in a position to have to build and consolidate, focused on ceasefire, but also on humanitarian aid, on restoring the UNRWA funding, none of which will be enough if there is not a ceasefire. So that still has to be first, last, and in between. Building that movement, we need alliances beyond the peace movement. You know, the peace movement has stood up to take on the work around Palestine, which many of you will remember for a long time was kind of anathema within the peace movement. Now it's a key component of it. But we also need to internationalize this movement and build our ties with peace movements and others around the world, prevent the attacks against South Africa that are going on in Congress. And we have to do something with this outrage that genocide has evoked in so many people in this country, not only those with a long-standing commitment to human rights or to working on changing foreign policy or working on Palestinian rights or any of this, but all of the progressive movements. You know, the labor movement, the anti-racism movements, the immigrant rights movement, environment, women, LGBT, youth, students, everybody, faith-based groups, everybody has been in the streets and needs to stay in the streets. I was with the South African foreign minister yesterday, and she was extraordinary. She said, somebody asked her, what can we in civil society do? And she said, do what you're doing and don't get tired. Don't stop. Stay in the streets. Stay with your petitions. Stay with your calls in Congress. This is how we change the role of what our country represents to the rest of the world. I'll stop there and we can take some questions. Thank you.
Okay, so if you have some questions, you raise your hand and Chuck will call on you or put that in the chat room. So we're gonna
already. Can I start with that one? About the domestic political stuff, AIPAC and its allies, will it make it impossible for Biden to change the US position? Ironically, no. AIPAC still has a ton of money. They've promised to spend $100 million on defeating Squad and almost Squad, anybody progressive, regardless of whether they've taken a position on Israel that AIPAC doesn't like, but they might. That's kind of the theory. $100 million for members of Congress. This is unprecedented. They're bragging about how no political organization has ever spent as much money as they plan to for this election. What they don't have any longer, debatable whether they ever did, but they certainly don't now, is control or influence over Jewish voting. That was what they always promised. We'll deliver money and we'll deliver the Jewish vote. Well, guess what? The Jewish vote ain't what it used to be. Young Jews are growing up with choices that those of us who grew up Jewish in the 50s and 60s never had. When I grew up as a Jewish kid in California, if you were Jewish and identified as Jewish, that meant Israel. You know, God really didn't play much of a role in it. It was all about Israel. That's not the case anymore. Young Jews are growing up with a whole different identity of what it means to be Jewish, looking at Jewish histories of social justice as the basis of their Judaism, not Israel. And the older generation knows they're losing the support of the youth. My organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, has doubled in size since October 7th. People are flooding to join. So AIPAC, you know, Biden can claim that it's all about AIPAC, and he won't be lying in the sense that AIPAC is putting huge amounts of money in, but ultimately that money, if it doesn't go to votes, doesn't really mean much. There has to be some courage there to say the world has changed, the discourse of the US has changed. 2 years ago, a poll of Jewish voters across the United States brought us an astonishing result. 25% of Jewish voters said they believe Israel is an apartheid state. 38% of young Jews said that. 44% of Democrats, this was about 6 months later, said Israel is like apartheid. They didn't say it is apartheid, they said it's like apartheid. This is partly a result of the last 25 years of work of the Palestinian rights movement, led by Palestinians, but always with a bunch of other people involved. And especially of the last 5 years, where we've seen extraordinary changes in how people see Israel in the world and how they see the US relationship to Israel. So Biden can make the claim that it's all about AIPAC, but it ain't true. AIPAC doesn't tell people how to vote. They can try and buy members of Congress. But if those members of Congress either get money from somebody else or don't believe that the votes are going to be there with AIPAC's money, that they're going to lose credibility if they take money from AIPAC. AIPAC's not going to be so powerful. That's the bottom line. This is all about Joe Biden, his personal beliefs. And he has decided that he's not willing to give up his personal belief that Israel can do no wrong. He thinks Netanyahu can do something wrong. And I have a lot of fear that that's going to be the kind of compromise. They're going to say, all right, we're going to get rid of Netanyahu. And then the next prime minister will be welcomed with open arms to carry out exactly the same war. Because this is not a war that Netanyahu has to fight to continue. People don't like Netanyahu, that's for sure. But it's not because he's waging this war, unfortunately. Benny Gantz, who just came to meet with members of Congress, who's probably the leading of the 3 possible new prime ministers that would likely be elected. Benny Gantz ran for prime minister a few years ago, and his, his campaign video was shot from a helicopter circling over Gaza. He was the commander of the attack on Gaza in 2014 that left 2,200 Palestinians killed. And his campaign video was, look what I did. Look at how I brought Gaza back to the Stone Age. That's why you should vote for me. He was appealing to the majority view in Israel. It's not everybody's view, obviously, thank God. But it is a very popular view. There was a reason that was the basis of his campaign video. He didn't create a video that talked about peace, that talked about we have to have a different kind of policy towards the Palestinians. He didn't do that because that's not how you win elections. You win elections by being tougher than the other guy. So my fear is they're going to get rid of Netanyahu. There'll be another election. They'll elect somebody else. And there'll be a huge sigh of relief from both parties in Washington and a huge welcome. It'll be like a conquering hero will come here and the war will continue. But it won't be Netanyahu. It won't be somebody who's so rude and so racist and so disrespectful of US presidents. It won't be that. It will be something different. But the war will be the same.
Okay. As I'm looking at the chat, there aren't any more questions. So what I'm suggesting is I'm going to allow people to unmute. And I see that Gail has used the reactions button and tapped the raise hand button, which is an excellent way to do it because it makes it very visible to us. So if you have a question, please use the reactions button. And Gail, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I have one specific question and one more general question, because you said that our own Congress is maybe trying to do something to punish South Africa. And I wondered if you could tell us more about what they're trying to do and if we can contact our Congress people to ask them not to do it. And then lingering in the background is always I mean, you're right. We need to put pressure on Biden. The things he's doing is terrible. But lurking in the background is always the fear of the other candidate for president who could end up being even worse. And I wondered if you had anything to say about that, because the more we say, okay, I mean, pressuring Biden, if he only gave up and changed his ways before November, it would be great. And then what if he doesn't, and just that kind of lingering fear that, I mean, Jared Kushner was even talking about Gaza, they should develop the waterfront property. And I mean, all the things that that could happen. You haven't mentioned that yet. And I wondered if you would, since you're talking about our strategy and what we can do to help Gaza.
Yeah, as I said, I work for a nonprofit. We are not allowed to either support or condemn candidates. So I talk about the policy of people in power. On the first question about the attack on South Africa, I'm trying to remember the names. It's a number of members of Congress that I'm not very familiar with. They're not all Republicans. There is one Democrat from Chicago whose name is Brad something, Brad Schneiderman, forgetting his name, who's one of the signatories on it. There's about 25 co-sponsors of the bill. What it calls for sounds not terrible. It sounds a little bit anodyne. It's basically, it calls for a reevaluation of the US-South Africa relationship. But it starts with a bunch of whereases, some of which are clear exaggerations and just not true, some of which leave out crucial things. But it uses language like the malign role that South Africa has played in the International Court of Justice, something like that. It's it's the language you use towards an enemy state. And South Africa is a big trading partner of the US. There's a lot of minerals. Not so great for the people of South Africa, I will say, because it destroys the environment, but it is a big part of the South African economy, is gold, cobalt, other materials that are used in green technologies, among other things. So there's a lot of US-South African trade. Tourism is also huge for the South African economy, and Americans make up a big chunk of South African tourism. So this is a close relationship. One of the things that's so ironic in this resolution, in the text, it makes reference with great outrage about the fact that South Africa carried out a military exercise with Russia about a year and a half ago, something like that. What it doesn't mention is that about 6 months before, was it before or after? I forget which came first, but about 6 months either before or after, it carried out a whole set of a 3-week long military exercise with the United States Navy, because its policy is, quote, non-alignment. They have good relations with everybody, or want to. I thought it was a rather stupid thing for them to do, a military thing with the US, because I don't like the US running around the world with its military anyway. But that's, nobody asked me. So, but that was never, of course, mentioned. That, yeah, they did military exercises with Russia, and they did military exercises with the US, and they did military exercises with Brazil, and they've done military exercises all over the world. You can argue about, really, is that a good use of resources for South Africa? But that's really none of our business. But this is our business. So yes, I would urge people. I'm sorry I don't have the details on it. Somebody, even maybe while we're talking now, somebody could Google House Bill South Africa reevaluate trade or something like that, and you'd probably come up with some reference to it. but there's a word, I haven't heard anything definite, that it might be voted on by the end of this week. It doesn't, it's one of these resolutions that's not going to have some huge impact right away, but it's a sign. It's a sign. It's like South Africa is being told you don't have the right to have an independent role in international affairs. This is not the first time the US does stuff like this. It has a long history. I wrote a book on US domination of the United Nations. And this was back in the era of so-called multilateralism for the US, in the Clinton years. This was in the 90s. And it's gotten worse since by a long shot. So. But the second part about the election, I will say that I think our goal should be to get Biden to change his policy. And that's important because the policy is genocidal. He is enabling genocide. And what Michigan did and what other states are doing now and have done to put electoral pressure on him to get him to change that policy is exactly what should be done, among other things. It's one of the key things that, you know, that's what politicians hear is how are they going to get reelected or not get reelected. It doesn't mean that another candidate might not be worse. It certainly doesn't mean. And it's not, it doesn't tell you the answer to what happens with the election. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is. But I'm hoping that before we get to that, Biden will feel compelled to change his policy. And the uncommitted campaigns in all these states is going to help that. We just have to do more of them.
Thank you. Phyllis, Steve Gold Googled it, and it's HR 7256, U.S. South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act.
Yeah.
Let me just add, may I just add that the sponsor of that is John James, congressman from Macomb County.
Oh.
It's interesting.
Very
Okay.
interesting.
When you call your members of Congress about it, you might remind them. Actually, if you're Googling right now, if you can look up U.S. South Africa military exercises, you'll get all the Pentagon press releases come up. But we'll get the dates of it because I really can't remember which one came first. They were about 6 months, a few months apart. I don't remember which one were first, but remind your members of Congress that the U.S. and South Africa also had joint military exercises.
Okay. Next up with their hand up is Dave Cottrell.
Hi, I've been dealing with the Sierra Club Michigan chapter, which I have very poor opinion of. And we used to be the chair of the Southeastern Michigan group. And I think Mike Bloomberg finances pretty much the Sierra Club. And I was wondering, is Mike Bloomberg part of the APEC?
It's a good question. I don't know the details. He's not a member. I mean, he may be a member of it. He's not one of their leading voices, particularly. That's not the entity he uses. Does he give them money? I don't know that.
Yeah. I tried to find out. I'd love to find out. Just might explain why. Okay, I'll tell it. The Southeastern Michigan group, which I was chair and Chuck Altman was on, and we not only put in 2022 our reasons for endorsing Andy Levin. At first, I was not going to endorse it because we had two Congress people, and they seemed to be at one point about same same experience, Haley Stevens and Andy Levin. And then it became very obvious that there's a huge difference between them. And there was a debate at Oakland University where they both were debating, and Andy was a better speaker, spoke to the points, purely a much better candidate. And so we voted for him unanimously, and normally we never, write up like individual reasonings. But in this case for Andy Levin, we did write about 8 people saying, I really like Andy because of this reason. There were lots of different, how he handles the issue, his understanding of it. We took that, we had the unanimous vote from the Southeastern Michigan group. I came to the Michigan Political Committee to to show our vote and our reasoning. The guy, Mark Meadows, who's the supposed chair and leader of that group, I am really burning my bridges with him because I really can't stand the whole organization. He was not there. I gave our written reasoning to the Michigan Political Committee and read the reasoning for it. And then Mark Meadows came to the Michigan Political Committee and used his influence to overrule us so we couldn't endorse Andy Levin over Haley Stevens. And then we eventually just had to say, oh, Haley Stevens won the primary. Sierra Club didn't give Andy any help. And Haley Stevens won. Oh, we'll endorse her. And I did point out that Haley Stevens was getting, millions of dollars of APEC. And it's like, oh, that's fine. So I guess that's why I'm kind of getting into, is Mike Bloomberg giving an influence, or what is this happening in the Sierra Club? Because it's like,
I'm
really through with the group.
I just don't know.
All right. Oh. There's a comment here, Phyllis, that what was posted about HR 7256. I'm just going to read it. Sorry, what I posted about the U.S. and South Africa took place in 2022. So
The bill or the military exercises?
The military exercises, the
that's
bill
right.
information's accurate.
Yeah, no, that's right. But do you have a month?
It
doesn't matter.
It was
just-
July and, for the bill?
No, for the exercises.
Oh, it was in July of 2022. I can't find anything.
That's all you need to know when you talk to your members of Congress, that in July of 2022, South
Okay.
Africa carried out military exercises with the US. So what's the problem?
Things have changed.
Well, yeah.
no comments in the chat, no questions in the chat. Ron, did you have a question?
I have a question for Phyllis. It's probably already been implied in what you've said, Phyllis, but I would like it if you could spell it out. Your sense of Chuck Schumer's, should we say, reversal, his speech of last week.
Yeah, when somebody like Schumer, who's been such a unchallengeable supporter of everything about Israel, comes out so strongly against the Netanyahu coalition, or at least against Netanyahu, it speaks to the influence that we have as a movement, that we forced that. He wouldn't have just done that on his own if nobody was ever paying attention to this. So that's a good thing. The part that's not a good thing is what I mentioned earlier, that I'm very worried that the degree to which the whole focus is personalized to this is all about Netanyahu, some of which is true because it's his get out of jail free card. Like the former president here, who is facing, theoretically years in prison, Netanyahu is facing years in prison, and it's much more likely there that he actually would have to serve them. They have a history in Israel of putting former prime ministers in jail. They actually take that stuff seriously. And he knows that. So he is desperate to stay in power. And the reason that he is allowing these extremists that are not necessarily his own politics, in the context of his coalition, keep in mind, his coalition is of the right, the far right, the extreme right, and the fascist right. That's the range. He's kind of close to the left of that range. So within that, the reason that he's willing to have a coalition with only these far right ones is that, not in his little war cabinet that he just put together, but in the governing cabinet, is because they're the only ones he can count on to keep him as prime minister and keep him out of jail. It's very personal. But that doesn't change the fact that the others are just as supportive of the war. They'll have some differences. They'll say, well, we don't have to attack Rafah first. There'll be some tactical differences, but none of them are saying we need to negotiate and not continue the war. This other question is an important one. Is it important to advocate for a two-state solution? In my view, it's not our business. It never was. Our business is what our government stands for, and that should be equality, human rights, and international law. It's up to the people who live there. I'm a Jewish girl from California. Why do I get to say how many states there should be 7,000 miles away? It just doesn't make any sense. Aside from that, as an analyst, when I look at it, there's no land for a Palestinian state. So it doesn't really matter if we want it or they want it or who wants it or who doesn't want it. It ain't going to happen. The irony is nobody's actually talking about a two-state solution. What they're talking about is a one-state, one-entity solution, which is not a solution. They're talking about forcible disarmament. The example is, well, there are many countries in the UN that don't have armies. Well, first of all, there's not. There's like two. The best of which is Costa Rica, which made a decision of its own that it would be safer without a military. And that's why they have really good healthcare in Costa Rica, because they don't spend money on the military. They made the decision to do that. It wasn't imposed on them from outside. Nobody says that the so-called Palestinian state would have control of its own borders, control of its own airspace, control of its coastal waters, control of its electrical grid, control of who goes in and goes out, control of its economy. It would not have control of any of that. There would be no independence, no sovereignty. It would not be a state. And there's no land for even that. So it doesn't really matter. But the starting point for me, I used to do a lot of work supporting one state because I really didn't believe that two states was just. But at a certain point, I realized this isn't my business. Who am I to be writing articles about that? No, I should stop. And I did. But I actually don't think it's our business. And I don't think we should be advocating about it. What I advocate when people ask me, when I meet with members of Congress, is to say, Congressperson, I really don't think this is our business. There's nothing to say about it. It's not really possible right now. But even if you think it is, it's probably not going to happen. But it doesn't really matter. It's not our choice. So I don't really think that's our business. And I just say that over and over again. It's not our business. We don't get to say how many states they have. We can say that however many states they have, there should be equality for all within each state and between both states. Nobody ever talks about that. So if people wanted to have, there was a time when you could imagine two states. It wasn't really just, but okay, there's lots of things that aren't just that still happen. You could have had two real states with equality for everybody within both states and equality between the states, but that's just not real. I think there's going to have to be what exists now is one state based on an apartheid system with two different legal systems. And which legal system applies to you has everything to do with race, nationality, language, religion. That's apartheid. That's the definition. But how to change that is a different question. Saying that that's what it is doesn't tell you what the solution is. For me, the solution is the South African one. You fight and you struggle for a non-apartheid version of that state. You don't further divide this already really quite tiny state.
Other questions?
Yes, this is Anita. In terms of furthering the leverage of the uncommitted vote, on last Sunday, there were a group of us around the table during social hall, and we came upon the notion of a contested convention if we're going to change Joe Biden's mind. Is anybody else talking about that?
There are people talking about it. Everybody I hear who says anything about it ends up saying, I don't think it's possible. And I don't think I know enough about internal Democratic Party structures to know exactly how it has to happen. What I do know is there's no evidence that the Democrats have a bench of people who are, possible options at this stage. I suppose Kamala Harris is as possible as anybody else, but yeah, I don't think so. So I think there are people who think about it, but I haven't heard anything serious about it. Let's just do maybe one more question.
Personally, I would vote for Gavin Newsom.
Okay. As far as I know, he's not running.
Just throwing it out there.
Okay. Phyllis, you just said one more question, I think, and Don Greenspan has his hand up.
Well, there's two questions left on the stack and one hand. So let's do those three. And we can do
Okay.
on the stack, I can do together. Let's do the third one, the person with a hand.
Okay, Don.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Phyllis, for a very wonderful and informative presentation. Now, you mentioned the ICJ and their ruling that there was a interim ruling there was a plausible case for genocide, and that Israel had 30 days to submit what measures they were going to take to alleviate that. And I'm wondering, did Israel just ignore that, or did they file anything? And if they ignored it,
No, they
does
didn't
the
ignore it. They didn't ignore it. They did file it, but it was what we were told was that it did not have any substantive claims, because they haven't done any, but they did go through the motions of filing something. It wasn't made public.
Well, then my question would be, does the ICJ have any power or authority to respond to the fact that Israel didn't really respond adequately to their
The answer for your question. No, they don't have any actual enforcement power. Any enforcement has to be as a request to the Security Council, which then, of course, a US veto means that it can go to the General Assembly. That all takes a long time, and it hasn't happened yet. But it's not likely to happen on the question of the report. They filed a report, is what they were required to do. The issue of that they're not abiding by the 5 actions is more significant. And the South Africans have requested another hearing on, another ruling on the threat of escalated genocide with an attack on Rafah. The court responded to that, saying that they believed there was an escalated threat, but they did not believe that a new ruling was necessary, that Israel should pay particular attention to the existing requirements the court had already issued in the context of a further threat of genocide. So that was for the other two that are on in the chat, which is basically the notion of a Jewish state and apartheid and Zionism, and those are obviously big questions. But the short version is, I don't think any state that identifies its citizens by religion can have equality for all its citizens. The question is, can its citizens fight for that equality? States don't give things. As somebody once said, power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has and it never will. And that's true about Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever states. No, they can't. They can't be equal if they're based on extra rights for people, which are then not rights, they're privileges. Not everybody has them, they're not rights. The apartheid question, from my vantage point, yes, because that's how I define Zionism in the context of apartheid and in the context of settler colonialism. There are people who don't define Zionism, who define it on the basis of a Jewish nationalist movement, and think that it's a legitimate basis for a state. I don't happen to think that's the case. But I also don't think that states have rights. People have rights. I don't think states have rights. I don't think France has rights. The US certainly doesn't have a right to occupy all the land that we occupy, but it is there, and it's not going anywhere. And there's no particular demand at this point that all the white people in this country get on boats and go back to Europe. If we were talking in the year 1640, that might be a legitimate demand. There were only a few hundred white settler colonialists. Times have changed. That's a reality. Nobody's saying that Israeli Jews should have to leave. That's not an option that anybody is putting forward. So the question is, what are the rights that belong to all the people of that land? And why shouldn't they be equal? That's really the question.
Okay. Very good. Linda, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. Well, Phyllis, I just want to thank you so much for this sobering and illuminating discussion. We covered so much ground. You really filled us in on the whole history and what we should be doing now. And in addition to being sobering, it was inspirational. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that.
And Rich, do you have anything to add? He's applauding. I
Thank
think
you
we should all do that.
Back into the streets. Keep up the good work. Keep up the work.
Yes, that's what we'll do. Thank you very much.
Thank
We
you.
will carry on as you've instructed us. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Wow. Okay, so I think we're ending the meeting now. Okay, I'm gonna just end it for everybody, okay? Thank you all. Thank you, Dave Cottrell. I see you there. We got you for our mailing list. We'll keep in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye.